I thought it would actually be interesting if I just like pitched you on a company that I'm like raising money for. Like, and I'm totally fine if you say no, by the way. Like if you don't want to do this or if you don't want to stay on air, but like I just think it would be kind of a fun like live Shark Tank thing.
I love it.
Okay, awesome.
Please.
This company Rectangle, right? Basically open source Stripe. So I guess Yod gave you the skinny on it. I mean, what were your critiques, or what were your biggest critiques?
Well, so I mean, look, let's start with a premise that I typically start with in companies at this stage, which is that ideas are cheap, execution is hard. The value is in execution. Is the idea of an open source Stripe sound? Absolutely. Could open source Stripe happen? Yes, for sure. Will open source Stripe happen? I would say it's likely, just given the macro trends that we are living with in terms of the evolution of APIs, the evolution of the entire ecosystem of tech stacks, and how companies are consuming them. Yes, I think it's likely that it will happen. So all the questions over here are in the category of not of when and how, not if. In other words, the thesis is sound, the idea is sound. Now it comes down to execution. And execution is messy, execution is hard, execution is error prone, and we have to just work through each one of them, each one of those elements.
Great. So let's start with one point I should make. So like I said, I will be involved in this company basically at like executive hiring level. So what I'm trying to do is basically get Yod with some money and then help him with executive hires and build a team around him. I know Yod's a great leader. So as far as execution,
let me first interrupt.
Sure.
Yod is a very interesting person. He has the kind of background that lends itself to being an amazing entrepreneur.
Right.
He's had all kinds of experience. And for those of your listeners who don't know, he comes from the Kurdish area of Iraq. He has seen enormous strife. He has seen lots of changes. He also has a great education. What I loved about him is that he has actually studied and he understands technology, and he has worked with Tim Draper, and he understands how venture and entrepreneurship and the Silicon Valley ecosystem works. So he's got a set of diverse experiences which he can bring to bear on this. And if he was to lean in and spend, all of the force of will on this, I think something very interesting can be built.
Right. So let's talk about execution. So what have I executed on? So Software Engineering Daily is a very successful software engineering podcast, 5 days a week, 5 ads per show, 50 weeks per year. So five ads per show times 5 shows per week times 50 weeks a year is 1,250 ad slots. We sell each of those ad slots quite aggressively. So we have like a well-run sales organization. We have like a staff of 3, basically. That's after hiring a CEO recently. So needless to say, we're a very high margin business. We have built some software. Software is not really core to our business. We're more of a podcast/media business. But we have a lot of growth channels. And the company is wholly owned by the people that run it effectively. So the incentives are more purely aligned than even a venture-backed company, I feel. Because we have a kind of like a cash-driven reward incentive structure. So it causes people to play really aggressively, sort of like a Goldman Sachs style reward system. So that's what I've done execution wise. Aside from that, I've done a bunch of failed startups, including one Ad4Prize that I literally poured all my money into because I didn't want to raise money for a company that I wasn't sure about. Like in my 6 years of podcasting, I haven't raised money once, and I haven't really tried to raise money once. That's despite having a lot of bad ideas. I had a lot of bad ideas. I was like, I don't want to pollute the waters. I want to make friends with all the venture capitalists. And then when I finally have good ideas, I can just be like, okay, give me money for this good idea. So that's where we're at now. Rectangle is that idea.
Jeff, I would again, ask you to think about the premise of your approach in making that conclusion that this is a good idea or a bad idea. I don't think ideas themselves. I mean, there are some that are obviously bad ideas or obviously great ideas, but most ideas are in neither of those extremes. And I would respectfully submit that Rectangle is not in either one of those two extremes. Maybe it is a little bit. I could argue it's closer to the obviously good idea rather than an obviously bad idea. But it's about execution. It's about what you do with it. Steve Jobs has a wonderful video where he talks about where greatness, where that insanely great quality that makes Apple so great comes from, where he talks about visiting this old man who lived down the street from him when he was a kid, who showed him how to take two ordinary rocks, just pick them out of his garden, throw them into a can of coffee, and he was connect them to a motor, and he would run that motor overnight. And you know what happens to those rocks the next day? I mean, they make this massive noise. And of course, I'm not talking in any way the elegance with which Steve Jobs describes this story, but you can look it up on YouTube. And he has this wonderful video where he says, you come back the next day and you have these beautiful, round, smooth, amazing rocks that started as just two ordinary rocks that you picked at random out of the garden. There was nothing special about them the day before, but the pressure and the repetition and the grinding that they went through overnight made them into two special rocks. And I think that's what makes companies great. That's what makes startups great. That's what makes people great. People become great when they throw themselves at the problem in that fashion, the way you have done with your podcast. And today you are so well recognized. I have had my CEOs, you've actually invited a couple of them before, who have asked me, hey, can you introduce me to Jeff? I'd love to be on that podcast. That is the outcome of that work that you put in, where you were the rock, which came out as this gleaming gem on the other side, which is what you are today in the world of podcasting.
Appreciate the compliment. But in terms of implementation, like, I mean, so you are critiquing the idea that, like, basically, okay, Jeff's got a kind of flashy sounding idea. I don't really care. I want to hear about the implementation. Like, that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, right? Is that fair? Like, let's talk about the implementation.
I'm saying yes, but what I'm also saying is, you have this idea. Now tell me what will give you an unfair advantage with this idea. Now tell me, to your point, what is the implementation? Now tell me, what would you do which someone else hasn't thought of, that you are working with, that will allow you to win in a way which will then let you leverage that into the next step and then the next step.
Sure. Gotcha. And by the way, I'll just and this is just to sweeten the conversation a little bit. So just want to let you know, it's like our first two investors are JJ from OSS Capital, and who is like the best in, I would argue, the best in open source, and then Hasib from Dragonfly, who I'd argue is the best in crypto. So those are our first two major investors. And then we have a third.
Congratulations. Thank you. JJ, Hasib, fabulous.
Thank you. Now, I don't say that because, like, I believe you're somebody who's just going to, like, follow the herd or something, but I'm just saying, like, there is, like, obviously some kind of signal there, like, undeniably. And so I'm just hoping that it'll just, like, anyway, give me some more credibility as I enter the implementation discussion and the sort of, like, what is the product sequencing discussion and so on. So look, I say this with all due respect to the company, both companies actually, but Stripe is the new Oracle, and everybody knows it. Like, nobody wants to be locked into the Stripe ecosystem. Everybody has to be locked in because maybe it's the new AWS, right? But AWS is the new Oracle. Like, I mean, not Oracle in the sense that they're actually going to exploit you anytime soon, but it's just the fact that they could exploit you. Just the fact that they have so much leverage over you and you don't really have any portability. I mean, this as an engineering leader, it's simply annoying, right? It's simply annoying to have somebody domineer over you. This is what, like, it took me 6 years of podcasting to understand this, but, like, that's the whole reason why open source is a huge deal, is, like, you can't be screwed in the way that Microsoft screwed people in the 90s. You just can't do that with an open source system, because it creates a market competition level that just creates, like, very, very desirable software. So open source is a very big deal.
Jeff, that was Stallman's original insight.
Right.
He called it software wants to be free. People want to be free. And that is absolutely unequivocally a true statement. And I agree with you completely over there. But to build a company and to then have that be a business on a long-term sustainable basis, you have to balance between those two extremes. Yes, for sure, people want to be free. They don't want to be locked into an ecosystem. They don't want to be held hostage, etc. But people also want reliability. They want a single throat to choke. They want predictability in what the future holds in terms of the roadmap. They want CYA. They want cover your ass. In other words, no one ever got fired for buying Oracle. No one ever got fired for buying IBM, etc. And people want that in jobs. And so you have to understand that is part of the allure of buying Oracle or of buying AWS, is that it's obviously the right decision. If you are a mid-level manager who is not creative, who is not thinking from first principles, who is only playing perhaps a political game inside their organization, it's an easy decision to say, let's just buy Oracle for the database.
You must be playing the devil's advocate here. You can't be serious about this argument, right? Like, you're basically arguing that Oracle is a successful company, which it kind of is, but basically the moves that it has taken have gotten it into a completely unwinnable position relative to AWS.
What I'm arguing is that if you want to be an entrepreneur and if you want to run a startup, your goal is to have the problem that Oracle has. Your goal in life is to reach the stage where people want to escape from where you are, because you need some form of lock-in. You need some barrier that you are creating, which you are then able to get a consumer surplus on. That's just first principles. There's got to be, I mean, Peter Thiel calls it running a monopoly. You know, you want to build a monopoly.
Absolutely. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you know much about the WordPress ecosystem?
No, that's not an area I've spent time on, unfortunately.
Okay. Can I give you a quick analogy using the WordPress ecosystem?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the WordPress ecosystem, WordPress founded probably, I don't know, 14, 15 years ago, something like that, maybe longer, by Matt Mullenweg. He also created WordPress.com. So you have the WordPress open source project, and you have WordPress.com, which is like Matt Mullenweg's hosted edition of WordPress. Now, WordPress.com is like pretty good. It's like a pretty well-run company, but it's like actually not the best WordPress company. The best WordPress company is WP Engine. So WP Engine is like the powerhouse. Like, if you go to Austin and you like look for the coolest places to work, WP Engine is one of them. Why is WP Engine cool to work at? Because it's hard to run WordPress well. Like, WordPress is a database, it's a front end, it's a back end, it's e-commerce, it's like everything. Like, what's the statistic? Is it 80% of the internet is WordPress, or 60% of the internet is WordPress? Have you seen that statistic?
I haven't seen that number, but I do know it's, dominant. No question about it.
Like, literally, of websites that people go to, like 50 to 60% are WordPress websites. That's kind of a staggering statistic. Like, I think there's a credible argument to be made that WordPress is like the web. It's like the Linux of web application development. It's like kind of like that universal. Maybe not the Linux. Maybe what's the best analogy? Like, what is WordPress to the browser?
Certainly, for example, in the US, you can think of it as the phone, right? I mean, the iPhone dominates in the US ecosystem. Doesn't mean we don't have Android or we don't have Samsungs, et cetera, that people are using. But it's a very special and very important part of that of the mobile ecosystem is the iPhone.
Right. Okay, great analogy. Okay, so WordPress, I think what we're building is like WordPress, where basically payments are such a rich ecosystem that we need to make a spin up your own Stripe-like piece of infrastructure. Basically, like, if you want to build a domain-specific payments company for drones, you should be able to do that. Not only that, based on what domain specificity you're targeting, our software, Rectangle, will allow you to config to route your payments through any payment gateway. So, like, normally your payment gateway is sort of like, just goes through Stripe or whatever, or goes through PayPal, like whatever payment gateway system you use. But like, we're the service mesh for payment gateways, right? We're the federation layer for payment gateways. Does that make sense? Does that sound compelling?
Totally makes sense. It's totally compelling. And what I'm saying is that if you pair that with actual execution and build this to a scale and a size that matters, which, let's say, put a number on it, 100 million in revenues, $500 million in revenues, okay, meaningful business. If you put around that, you will then create a gravity. You will then modify the rest of the world, which will start thinking, this is a better way of doing things. This is the right way of doing things. And things will evolve around you as a mechanism and a way of doing things with it. So there isn't a right or a wrong answer as the future architecture for technology or for payments. These are relatively arbitrary decisions that we have made. In the US, credit cards are very popular. In other parts of the world, they are not popular at all. In India, the government open sourced a payment stack and revolutionized online payments. They did it because they were trying to create a low-cost way and to reduce corruption, to make payments more transparent and reduce the cash economy. So people do it for different reasons in different places, and you end up with these solutions which only in hindsight can you go and say, aha, that's why they were doing that. And what I'm telling you is that the future is path dependent. If you have a great entrepreneur who takes a particular path and decides that that is the way they want to approach the future, that increases the likelihood that the future will look like that.
I mean, I think we're agreeing here. I'm
Yes,
not sure.
Absolutely. I am agreeing with you.
Gotcha.
But I'm going taking it to the next step. And I'm also telling you how it is that we will agree. Why
Okay.
the outcome will come out that way.
Great.